Welcome back to our second panel on therapeutics and healing. So for this panel, we have two presenters. And before I introduce them, let me just introduce myself again. I am Dr. Ismail Montana, and I will be chairing alongside with Dr. Abdulhamid Hania, who is going to serve as moderator for this panel. As for our panelists, we have two panelists. I will introduce them before their presentations. So in the order, we're going to go in the order of how they are listed on the program. Our first presenter is Dr. Katie Boyle, or Dr. Katie Boyle, who recently completed a PhD in history at Harvard University with a secondary field in the studies of women, gender, and sexuality. Dr. Boyle's dissertation, entitled Site of Servitude, examines slavery, race formation, and empire in Ottoman Tunis from 1736 to 1895. Dr. Ball's research has been supported by fellowships from the American Institute of Maghreb Studies, AIMS, and the Waterhead Center for International Affairs, as well as the Harvard Center for Middle Eastern Studies, Tunis. Dr. Boyle will be moving to Middlebury, Vermont, to begin a 2-year postdoctoral fellowship at Middlebury's Axon Center for the Humanities this fall. Please join me in congratulating and also welcoming Dr. Boyle to present her presentation. And then we will introduce our second panelist just before she starts. So the floor is all yours.
الشكر. صباح. Good morning, bonjour à toutes et à tous. I want to first thank everyone here for attending. Thank you to Semat and Beit al-Hikma, especially Dr. Mahmoud Ben Randan, Dr. Shamia, Nina Kraus, and Luke Scalone. And thank you especially as well to my fellow panelists, moderators, and chairs. Thank you, Dr. Montana, for the kind introduction. Merci, Dr. Abdelhamid Hania. Thank you, Dr. Leila Tayeb. Very excited to be on this esteemed panel. And thank you for facilitating and hosting us the past 2 days for the performances of Sheikh Shadli Bedali and Ziad Zouari, and the opportunity to center the artistic production and the history of Stambeli. And to be clear, I am not a specialist on Stambeli, but I am interested in how accounts of Stambeli therapeutics and archival sources can amplify the rich histories and social worlds of Black Tunisians in the early to mid 19th century in Ottoman Tunis. I also just want to add a content note before we get started. So some of the archival sources today that we'll be looking at together do include some offensive racist terms and some material that includes racial violence against Black women. So please do whatever you need to take care of yourself, and thank you again. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. I want to begin my talk today by asking 2 questions. What stories can be told of people treated as archival afterthoughts? And how might Stambeli, as therapeutic and embodied practice, amplify the lives of those who have been sidelined in conventional archival historical narratives? I want to talk about Ambra today, an enslaved person living in the Ottoman province of Tunis in the early 19th century. I came across mention of Ambra not in Tunis, in fact, but over 500 miles north of the continent in the French colonial archives in Aix-en-Provence, and roughly 200 years after she came under the scrutiny of a French doctor working for Hassine Bacha Bey. The doctor described Ambra as, quote, a young negress, suffering from pain that shot from her shoulders down to her forearms. She had been unable to perform domestic labor. The doctor wrote that Ambra, quote, consented willingly to cauterization or medical burning. And this is a phrase we should be particularly skeptical of, given the power dynamics inherent in this situation. Burning her back and shoulder 4 times, he noted that the marks oozed pus for nearly 2 months. The doctor alleviated Ambra's pain to ensure her ability to labor, so her mistress would not have to. How did Ambra come to be captured in this French doctor's diary? What were her own understandings of health and her body? And how might Stambeli therapeutics counter or even challenge dominant narratives like that of the French doctor? These are the questions that animate the work I do. I'm a social, cultural, and intellectual historian of modern Africa with a focus on Ottoman Tunis, and my key research commitments are to amplifying the rich histories of enslaved people as they made their lives in the province. In contrast to the French doctor's understandings of the purpose of medicine, I make the case that Ambra and the broader Black community of Tunis in the early 19th century possessed their own worldviews about health, grounded in community that merged religious and therapeutic knowledge from Hausaland, the circle on the left, Kanem-Borno Empire, the circle on the right, and Ottoman Tunis. In the early mid-19th century, these epistemologies were not merely alternative, but were instead equally, if not more popular among inhabitants of Tunis compared to the medical praxis as embodied by the French doctor. Drawing on an array of Western and Northern African alongside European archival material, I engage in what I conceptualize as archival counter-readings to amplify the lives and worldviews of enslaved people through close critical readings of Arabic, French, Italian, and English language documents. By doing so, my goal is to consider how we might read for embodied life that persists even in the violent recesses of state archives. In this presentation, I'll be sharing findings from Chapter 4 of my book project on comparative slavery in Ottoman Tunis, where I close read archival excerpts from the French doctor Laurent Gay's memoir on illness and medicine on the left here, alongside an understudied account by an anonymous French writer featuring substantial commentary on Bouri Stambeli here on the right. And in turn, I pour over a document we may now be more familiar with thanks to my colleagues' presentations yesterday, Dr. Montana and Dr. Jankowski, this admonition penned by Fulani Islamic reformer Ahmed ibn al-Qadi at Timbuktu in 1808 against the alleged cult of Bouri, alongside commercial registers with an eye toward shifting language around race and slavery from the mid-18th to the late 19th century. And just a note on this document. So, for example, this is a ship manifest that I found in the British National Archives. It's from the late 18th century. And although the two documents side by side, one in English, one in Arabic, are technically supposed to be equivalent or equal translations, part of my work is understanding how terms related to race were not commensurate across English and Arabic. So for example, on the left, we see this document saying 2 slaves, men, ditto blacks. On the right, we see supposedly the equivalent, adin khedim. But in fact, when I'm looking at these documents and noticing the terms adin khedim in Tunisian fiscal registers in the same time period, these are really specific. They don't just mean black. They mean enslaved people recently conveyed from Hausaland and Kanem-Borno Empire, gendered as men or gendered as women. So the terms are not exactly the same, and that's part of the larger project that I won't get into so much in this presentation, but I'm happy to talk about that in the question and answer. For the sake of time, again, I'm just going to be primarily focusing on an account of race, medicine, and Stambeli, written by an anonymous French observer here. And I invite you to think with me about how to read historical documents about enslaved people that are heavily mediated by Western European as well as by Western and Northern African elites. Ambra, from the opening of this talk, remains a spectral trace in the archives, preserved and perpetuated through violent acts of dislocation. Even her name, Ambra, was likely forced upon her in servitude. Ambra clearly doesn't speak for herself in the doctor's journal, nor in my own unresolved questions as a white American historian poring over the document. Ambra features among the thousands of inhabitants of Tunisia, racialized as Black, who have been used, who have been used to tell all kinds of stories. French observers like the doctor narrated tales of Black health as synonymous with labor capacity, while Western African Muslim elites visiting Tunis in the early 19th century, like Timbuktu, condemned the Sudan Tunis, or the Blacks of Tunis, to death for their allegedly heretical religious practices.
I think you should pause to tell them this is on purpose.
Oh, this is on purpose. Voilà. No, pas de souci. So even while analyzing archival documents produced by elites, I take seriously the ways in which individuals like Ambra left their mark on the archival record, particularly through accounts of embodied and therapeutic praxis of Stambeli. So let's take a closer look at a French writer's mid-19th century account of Stambeli. Despite Timbuktu's call that we saw yesterday for the Bey to admonish and even condemn to death Stambeli practitioners at the turn of the 19th century, Bouri Stambeli remained a potent force of social and therapeutic life in Tunis in later decades. Indeed, Stambeli's existence and popularity alongside the therapeutic epistemologies embodied by the French doctor at the start of this talk indicate that medical expertise in 19th century Tunis was by no means dominated by one group of practitioners over another. European, as well as Western and Northern African medical practices were on the one hand based in shared beliefs, including the importance of natural elements, the validity of empiricism or the experiences of the senses in the body, and even divine causation. On the other hand, the French doctors focus on a cure, in contrast to Stambeli Therapeutics' emphasis on coexisting with the spirits or the jinn comprising the Bois Stambeli pantheon, point to a meaningful divide in terms of the purpose of therapeutics between elites like the doctor versus Stambeli adepts, perhaps people like Ambra from the opening of this talk. Even while Western European commerce had come to dominate Ottoman Tunisian commercial affairs by the mid-19th century, Stambeli Therapeutics remained a potent force among practitioners, whether racialized as Black or as Muslim, and even among Europeans. Commerce de Tunis avec l'intérieur de l'Afrique, a report located in the same trove of documents as the doctor's journal in the French colonial archives, and anonymously published by a French observer in 1847, the year after Ahmed Bey's legal abolition of slavery across the province, demonstrates the degree to which Bouri Stambeli Therapeutics could shake racialized hierarchies embodied by the silencing of Ambra from the top of the talk, straight to their core. In the report, a French observer asked Stambeli practitioners about their geographic origins, socioeconomic status, as well as their social and therapeutic worlds. And like Timbuktu, he also focused on what he perceived as racialized and gendered leadership of public Stambeli ceremonies, or the Arifa or Arayif. Observing that, quote, negresses in the capital had 3 zawaya, the Dar Jama'ah, he noted that these were the spaces where women carried out the ritual ceremonies of, quote, their countries every Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. Although the French writer's voice subsumed his interlocutors, counter-reading his accounts of Stambeli ceremonies invites us to speculate on the social and therapeutic world of inhabitants like Ambra, and how Bouri practitioners responded to his inquisitive gaze in ways that subverted the marginalization of Black women in Beylical society. Notably, the Frenchman wrote in a very long footnote, it's a 1.5-page footnote, that one Saturday, the same Black woman who had brought him to a Stambeli ceremony the day prior came to his home once more saying that the Arifa, or spiritual leaders of Stambeli therapeutic ceremonies, were waiting for him at the communal house, Sidi Ayed. The writer explained that to avoid being thrown out of the space, as had happened to him the day prior, he would be seated in a corner near the musicians so that he could not see the female adepts, nor could the women see him. What he described as dances promptly commenced. The Arifa, or the simple negresses, his term, who enter the scene are those who identify with one or another beneficent spirit, he writes. They will either fight or conjure evil spirits. He uses the word jinn or jinn. I also saw, he writes, a negress dancing on her knees, lifting her hand to the heavens in agitation, then striking the ground over and over with clenched fists, leaving the stage only by force when seized by the Arifa, who made her sit and wiped the sweat from her brow. This spirit, ce génie, came before me, embraced me with a growl, and prophesied, saying that he will always be with me, and that he will protect me during my voyage. The author arguably perceived the public Stambeli ceremony to be something like an exorcism, fighting with evil spirits, or a seance, conjuring. Similar to the doctor who treated Ambra at the beginning of the talk, who understood the purpose of therapeutics to be curative, vanquishing evil spirits, rather than, as contemporary practitioners of Stambeli have noted, a means by which to coexist with one's jinns in the Stambeli pantheon. Nevertheless, the French observer clearly took an interest in spirit possession. It is not clear if the participant he described was an afflicted client, an arifa, or an observer taken in by the ceremony. But, as I tried to put in bold here, it's a little hard to see, the narrator slips in terms of gender. He moves from the term negress or black woman to spirit, ce génie, indicating how Stambeli therapeutics could reshape racialized and gendered hierarchies. Indeed, the use of therapeutic practices to transform these norms, moving from the term negress to the masculine spirit, demonstrates how Stambeli therapeutics threaten to subvert racialized and gendered hierarchies that comprise the ideology not only of this observer from France, but also 19th century Tunisian social life itself. The author's thick descriptions of public Stambeli ceremonies also lead one to wonder if the author found himself moving from the position of observer, tucked away in the corner, to an active participant during the ceremony. In a now iconic text of performance studies, theorist Irving Goffman has described, quote, unmeant gestures that take place in daily life. In one example of audience and performer, Goffman offers the example of a patient and a doctor, and poses the question of what happens when performances of authority, in this case, the authority of an objective Frenchman, an expert of commerce, becomes disturbed by an impression inconsistent with the performance. In the case of the Frenchman at the Stambeli ceremony, his performance as a disinterested observer in the corner, writing a report for the French consulate perhaps, gave way to a very different performance, even a reversal of who was performing and who was being performed. Goffman has written that, quote, this difference forces an acutely embarrassing wedge between the official projection and reality. For it is part of the official projection that it is the only possible one under the circumstances, end quote. While the author did not appear so embarrassed as to have excluded these events from his account, he did, however, relegate the ceremonies to a footnote at the bottom of the page. And this is a really curious choice, perhaps a testament to the subversive power of Stambeli therapeutics and of its practitioners, typically hailed pejoratively as, quote, negresses or khedim in the case of Tunisian fiscal registers and Tobaktawi's polemic. Indeed, although state archives, and especially French colonial archives, tend to treat Black inhabitants of Tunis as silent figures who need to be spoken for, like the patient racialized as Ambra from the opening of the talk, counter-reading elite documents to flesh out the possible social worlds of 19th century Black Tunisians offers us rich, if unfinished, historical narratives. Ultimately, Stambeli therapeutics, even if mediated and surveilled by the Beylical state, were subversive because they were necessarily dependent on and born from change. Out of the violent dislocation of captives from Hausa land and Kanem Borno Empire to the Maghreb emerged a potent epistemology, or what historian of science Pablo Gomez has described as, quote, a transportable and creative praxis for the production of local power, end quote. Individuals racialized as Black in early mid-19th century Tunisian society had been described by Western and Northern African, as well as European observers, as passive, brutishly willful, nameless, or heretical. However, Stambeli offered practitioners the power to understand and treat not only their own bodies, but also potentially that of their current or former enslavers, as indicated by Timbuktui's concern that free Muslims were also eager adepts. Within Stambeli Diyar Jama', individuals could establish bonds of protection thicker than those provided by the Ottoman Beylical state, thicker than the adoption of an enslaver's family name, and deeper and broader than could be accounted for in conventional archival narratives. Stambeli therapeutics were not and are not a static practice. Ultimately, they remain vibrant, relevant, and powerful by harnessing the omnipotent force of change. Thank you so much for your time and attention, and I welcome your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Boyle, for wonderful presentation and finishing right on time. So we will move now to our second presenter, and that is Dr. Layla Ayib, who is going to give her talk on the following title, To Follow Busadiya. Dr. Layla Talib is Assistant Professor of Performance at Northwestern University in Qatar. Dr. Tayyib received her PhD in Performance Studies from Northwestern University in Chicago and hold a master's degree in Performance Studies from New York University and International Affairs from the New School. Prior to joining Northwestern University in Qatar, Dr. Tayyib held positions as Humanities Research Fellow for the study of the Arab world at New York University in Abu Dhabi, and Stanford Taylor Postdoctoral Associate in Music and Islam in Contemporary World at Cornell University as well. With a primary focus on performance and politics in contemporary Libya, Dr. Tayyib's writing has appeared in numerous journals, including the Middle East Journal of Culture and Communication, Literal, and the Arab Studies Journal, among others. She is also a founding co-editor of Lamma, a journal of Libyan studies. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Tayyib to present her, to give her talk. So the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Montana. My sincerest thank you to everyone who's put work into organizing this symposium, which has been such an absolute pleasure to get to soak up all the way until the end before having to come up here and offer my contribution. Okay, so I want to first paint a scene for you. A children's call and response in 1940s Benghazi led its singers on a search without end. وين حوش بوسعدية قدم لك قدام شوية. Where is Busadiya's house? Nobody's smiling at my singing. Come on, guys. Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you. Just continue forward a little more. go the instructions. Moving in a group as they followed these repeated instructions, kids stepped forward in rhythm, snaking through the streets around their homes. Oral histories of the time report that Busaidia himself would sometimes show up, a dark-skinned man with a large round drum or smaller percussive instruments, singing in a language these Arabic-speaking children did not understand. Barefoot and wearing tattered clothes, yet adorned in feathers with a headdress that featured a bird's beak, the image of Busaidia was striking. Photographs of the performers who played him circulated in Italian language media and colonial postcards such as this one. The game of following Busaidia continues to be widely referenced in popular culture today, though in Libya the character himself has long since died out. In songs and in fiction, in jokes and in politics, the ghost of Busaidia continues to traverse Libyan cultural life. The focus of my contribution today is to explore how and why what is alive and vibrant in Tunisia, and as we've heard in Algeria, and we can argue in Morocco, is disappeared and made a site of nostalgia in Libya. How does that happen? Across media and daily life, remembering Busaidia is partial, unsettled, and unsettling in Libya. The stories surrounding the name depart and conflict. One argues that they once knew him, another that he never was. The same joke is told again and again when someone offers a backstory for Busaidia or tries to historicize him. Others comment, finally we know something about Busaidia. Or the bigger punchline, now can you tell us finally where is Busaidia's house? Yet even while many attempt to ventriloquize Busaidia, assigning him a history or the absence thereof, the specter of Busaidia provokes and unsettles those who remember him. Busaidia's performances are a haunting, which, to follow Avery Gordon, describes how that which appears to be not there is often a seething presence, acting on and often meddling with taken for granted realities. To follow Busaidia, then, is to confront the ongoing unresolvedness in Libyan cultural politics of the country's histories of slave economies and the hierarchies left in their wake, an unresolvedness evoked by the performative repetition in the game itself of trying to find Busaidia's house. Gordon points out that while frightening, haunting, unlike trauma, is distinctive for producing a something to be done. The kinetic and discursive repetition in the children's game embodies this something to be done as both concrete and elusive. Just continue forward a little more. This will be a little bit jarring, so warning.
ذكروا منكز هنا المتمرد والظلم مستفز ولا بنغازي الراكد ريح النية شايب مبتسم يتذكر وين حشبه صعبية ولا بنغازي نلي ضد المر 4 عقود نمشي نتجلى في حفر ولا بنغازي ما نقبل عزاء انا طالب مرمي في الحروب كبش في ذا ولا بنغازي الطيبة مع البعارة يمات عشان النبي غبية انا الشرارة ولا بنغازي صناع الجوناطية من بحر الصبري للثم للبنكينة لا انا لعيب الكورة انا اللي هبدو نديم من قبل الثورة ولاد بنغازي ما ننسى راسي كسح انا اللي شارعي مظلم ما يولد.
ممكن نقطع اوكي ممتاز شكرا جزيلا اوكي fantastic. All right. Oh, we still have it from there. Isa wants to be heard. Okay. So just one example of Busaidia's ghostly presence appears in Isa Bendaradef's 2015 I Am Benghazi. Bendaradef reperforms and thematizes the Busaidia children's song, knowledge of and love for which become, in this framing, a central component of a Benghazino identity, one of the things that evidences a person's belonging and witness to their city's long history. Here, the native sons remember Busaidia. Bear with me, I'm having PC versus Mac troubles. Never mind. I wanted to show you a section of the video where there's a group singing Busaidia. So singing the Busaidia song. Okay. My own father, now in his 80s, might be counted among these native sons who remember Busaidia. Not a man of stories, he has always lit up when I've asked him about this song. He remembers the rhythmic movement of the game and the excitement that overcame him when Busaidia himself would appear. But the enthusiasm with which official and popular sources celebrate the memory of Busaidia is matched only by the strength of this remembering's omissions. Remembering Busaidia in Libya is an example of what the performance theorist Joseph Roach calls surrogation, the consequential process through which communities attempt to substitute, as he puts it, into the cavities created by loss through death or other forms of departure. As survivors endeavor to make sense of their world as it remains in the wake of death and departure, they attempt to fit alternates into the spaces vacated. We might think of this impulse as one towards smoothing over, a narrative and affective paving that alters successive generations' access to the nuances or even the fact of histories of social violence. Unsurprisingly, this process is continually ongoing as actual or perceived vacancies occur in the network of relations that constitutes the social fabric. Moreover, it is nearly always unsuccessful. The intended substitute, in Roach's words, cannot fulfill expectations, creating a deficit, or actually exceeds them, creating a surplus. Either type of misfire is consequential. We can understand the ongoing practice of remembering Busaidia through Roach's theory of surrogation, both in the increasing amnesia that accompanies the figure and in what this amnesia and the figure himself enable Libyans to forget. Over the 20th century, successive generations of Libyans lost elements of the Busaidia performance practice such that someone born in the 1940s remembers both the song and the live Busaidia enacted. Someone born in the 1960s remembers the song but not Busaidia himself, yet knows of him and thinks they remember an empty or haunted house said to be his. Someone born in the 1980s knows the song but nothing further. The state of cultural research in Libya being as fragmented and undermined as it has been, and the acknowledged willful forgetting that enables collective memory through performance, the unacknowledged willful forgetting that enables collective memory through performance being as powerful as it is. One finds declarations of mystery and curiosity surrounding Busaidia in popular forums from the recent past. For example, a 2016 blog post on the now defunct discussion website naqash.com repeats the familiar refrain of the Busaidia song, then explains it as, quote, a popular song that we perhaps all sing while we don't know what it means or who Busaidia is. Similarly, a Moroccan television segment from 2013 describes Bousaidia as light entertainment in Libya, roaming the streets to bring joy and laughter to children and adults, with no attendant backstory. Narrations of Bousaidia as a clownish figure can be traced back at least as far as the colonial photography that makes up some of the scant archive on Bousaidia practices, as in this caption describing Bousaidia as the Libyan buffoon. In these accounts, I argue to remember Bousaidia is specifically to forget local histories of enslavement. However, these surrogative speech acts of remembering through forgetting inadvertently leave gaps through which an agentive, spectral Bousaidia moves between the past and the present. Performance theorists Colbert, Jones, Jr., and Vogel remind us that Western conceptions of history and time have rendered minoritarian subjects frozen in the past, lagging behind and perpetually on the threshold, even as historical traumas erupt in the present. As a result, minoritarian categories develop substance and significance through a dizzying back and forth toggle in time, in which subjects experience multiple temporalities simultaneously or out of joint. These insights operate somewhat differently in Libya, itself subjected to colonial notions of time. What becomes salient here is how the effects of these temporal layers interface with a racialization of space with which we are quite familiar, in which Northern Africa is figured as naturally distinct from the broader continent. I have argued elsewhere that regional cultural constructions of race render Black subjects always arriving and never native to North Africa. Bousaidia dances across both of these figurations, playing as he does between a here and an elsewhere, a now and a then. If performance has the capacity to warp or subvert the familiar and dominant through restorations, as repair or as mending, of what has been forgotten, overlooked, misremembered, suppressed, dormant, or denied, then Bousaidia persists in digging up the past that he has been oft meant to cover over. The real possibilities for restoration may not be buried very far down. If Bousaidia's vulnerability is a racist trope in many and dominant Libyan representations, this idea that he's sort of going from place to place and asking for whatever people can give him, it may nonetheless also be a site for performing repair. The less ubiquitous second line of the children's song, included in a 1976 recording, says, "And the water carrier has brought him water. Let's pour some for him. He is thirsty." Indeed, as we know from the work of scholars in this room, in the Tunisian iteration of the performance practice, Bousaidia embodies both strangeness and hospitality. In Tunis, Bousaidia is said to be the one who could guide new arrivals to communal houses, places of respite, where people spoke their language and could help them acclimate to the city. Through this narrative, Bousaidia's wandering ceases to be only mournful yearning for a lost home and a lost family, and it becomes also the practical means through which displacement is endured in community. A similar network of communal houses may, or perhaps must, have existed in the urban centers of Libya where Bousaidia was known. I'm going to talk a little bit about dance theory now. In his seminal Critical Moves, Dance Studies in Theory and Politics, Randy Martin writes of dance as a kind of embodied practice that makes manifest how movement comes to be by momentarily concentrating and elaborating in one place forces drawn from beyond a given performance setting. Understood in this way, dance offers an analytic through which to theorize the socio-political contexts with both house and exceed it, as well as a site in which to interrogate how these histories coalesce in narrative and affective forms. In the character's unending search for his kidnapped daughter, Bousaidia performance, which I didn't pause to tell the story because I assumed everyone in the room knew it, but I don't know if we've actually told it over the symposium. This idea of the legend of Bousaidia being that he's Bousaidia, he's the father of Saidia, and she's been kidnapped and taken to the north, right? So in the character's unending search for his kidnapped daughter, Bousaidia performance concentrated and elaborated the forces of 19th and early 20th century trans-Saharan slavery, making manifest how certain movements of people came to be. While I frequently use Busaidia performance for the phrase's ability to accommodate a multifaceted constellation of acts, discourses, and affects, I read this constellation through the lens of dance in order to draw on the particular theoretical capacities that centering moving bodies enables. This is then dance as an embodied, contested site of movement, stillness, repetition, retention, and repair. Even while popular practices of remembering Busaidia have enabled generations of Libyans, I think, to undertake a willful forgetting of the intimate violences of the trans-Saharan slave trade, a critical reading of this same practice, of Busaidia performance practice as dance, enables an excavation of this history, an elucidation of the ways it continues to echo in contemporary Libya structurally and affectively, and a call to reckon with these through dance as theory. So I wonder how Busaidia himself moved. The focus in most descriptions on Busaidia's vocal performance and his drumming renders him sort of like a supporting character to the audience, even while his is solo performance. I wonder how long he lingered during the stiller moments of his procession. Was he often encircled, as is suggested by some of the archival evidence, or were these rather posed configurations for the benefit of the camera that did not reflect common practice? Did he seem to direct himself toward a particular endpoint as he stepped? Or did his walking look or feel more like the wandering and searching of his legend? How did he interact with others in the public spaces through which he moved, whether those who stopped to watch him or those attending to other business? Written sources centralize the motion of spinning and the multisensory interweaving that this created of Busaidia's movement with the percussive sounds of the metal cans attached to the fabric of his clothing. Libyan author Ahmed Laneza, for example, wrote that as the children in Benghazi's Ben Omran street market crowded around, Busaidia, quote, would begin playing his instrument and it would emit the melodies to which he would begin to dance, hitting the ground with his patched slippers, singing and turning around himself in slow movement, the sound of what's written as a qithara mixing with the rattling of bones and the clanging of empty cans. I think it's worth imagining how this pedestrian stylized movement of proceeding from place to place might have combined with the slow spin Lanezi describes. Hitting the ground in patched slippers or without shoes would have been both a component of Busaidia's dance and how he arrived at the performance space, moved about through the day, and took himself back home again. Martin writes of what moving bodies accomplish through movement as mobilization, emphasizing that the notion's political potential comes from this doing, rather than from the compulsion of, quote, an alien power. It may be necessary to think of Busaidia's movement as accomplishing something, even insofar as his legendary search never met its goal. He danced a perpetual liminality, which itself is productive of a certain kind of terrain of possibility. If, in Martin's words, through mobilization, bodies traverse a given terrain that by traversing they constitute, then Busaidia, in mythically traversing the Sahara and then daily traversing city streets, repeatedly constituted a terrain of possibility for a reckoning with the histories that his performance both called to mind and allowed people to forget. Haunting decades of cultural production since, he continues to remind us of the need for such a reckoning. At the same time, he traced a singular path, one that might be mined by those living in the limits of the present, in Munosian terms, in improvising a route among and through audiences that at once signified his aggressors and those amid whom he survived. Busaidia was engaged in, as scholar of improvisation Daniel Goldman would put it, giving shape to himself by deciding how to move in relation to an unsteady landscape. Okay, so to conclude, I want to underscore the importance of the work that we have been attempting over the past 2 days. I suspect that tracing appearances, disappearances, and differing forms of Busaidia performances across the different parts of Northern Africa can tell us quite a bit about how the countries along this top of the continent have variously absorbed the trans-Saharan movement of people, which has been central to their pasts and presents, into a collective unconscious. To follow Busaidia into the recesses of normative embodiment and narrated social cohesion reminds us that while dance may be a site of mobility, mobility is not always liberating. Rather than a fait accompli, liberation appears, if it does, in memories of Busaidia as a horizon of potentiality, one that requires seeing the ghost. Joseph Roach writes that the most persistent mode of forgetting is memory imperfectly deferred. This persistence is spatialized in Busaidia, enabling a continued forgetting as we search and just go forward a little more. Yet perhaps, and here I'll conclude, in the perpetual search for Busaidia's house, we might also read a yearning of the sort that fomented here, fomented in Libya, fomented elsewhere in 2011, and for many of us has been difficult to speak in the years since. As Avery Gordon reminds us, we need to know where we live in order to imagine living elsewhere. We need to imagine living elsewhere in order to live there. Perhaps this same wisdom suffuses the provocation, where is Busaidia's house? Perhaps this same argument underscores the deferral of an answer. Perhaps in the repetition of the game, there is ever the possibility to move differently this time, to enact restoration as repair. Busaidia continues to compel us both because he seems to promise the cohesion, I argue, that we lack, and also because underneath that promise, he demands deeper redress. We in Libya are often reminded that to be Libyan is to be the grandchildren of Omar al-Mukhtar. Are we not also the grandchildren of Busaidia? Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Tayyip. I don't think there would be any discussion of Stambeli that will be. Thank you, Dr. Tayyip. I was saying that I do not think there would be discussion of Stambeli without Busaidia. And you have really kind of given us a lot about this figure within Stambeli practice. So I am going to defer the floor now to my colleague, Ustaz Henia, who is moderator, and then we'll take it away. So the floor is all yours. Thank you.
D'accord, merci. Merci. Je donne la parole à la salle. Après, il dirait quelque chose. Allez-y. Allez-y. Quel est votre nom, s'il vous plaît?
هاجر جريدي، باحثة دكتوراه في حول موضوع الأقلية السوداء في تونس بين الذاكرة والنسيان. الإسطنبولي هو جزء من البحث الذي أقوم به. سأتحدث عربية فصحى لأنني متمكنة من اللغة أكثر من الإنجليزية والفرنسية حتى يسمعني الجميع لو ممكن. لو أتحدث عن ملاحظات عديدة سأبقى إلى الغد ولا أكمل، ولذلك سأختصر. على بعض الملاحظات. فيما قيل أن أن هناك ممارسة نوعا ما للعنصرية في تونس في فترة ما حسب الأبحاث التي قامت بها الدكتورة. حسب البحث الذي قمت به وهو بحث متواضع، ولكن مظاهر العنصرية أنا كموقف مني أنفيها تماما عن البيات وعن المجتمع التونسي. صحيح هناك طبقية، والطبقية موجودة مع البشر من أول معناها من بداية الخلق، ليس من الآن فقط. ولكن بالنسبة للباقي إذن عندما نتحدث عن العنصرية، الأقلية السوداء في تونس لم تعامل كعبيد، يعني كان هم طبقة اجتماعية معينة لها وظيفة معينة. صحيح هناك النظرة العليائية باعتبار أنه هذا سيد وهذا ولكن وفق تراتبية اجتماعية وليس عنصرية ضد اللون. بالنسبة إلى البي، عندما أقر قرار العتق، وأرى أنه يفترض نحن كتونسيون نفتخر بذلك، لأننا كنا من الرائدين في هذا المجال، وحتى أمريكا وغيرها من الدول الأخرى التي تدعي الإنسانية وتدعي يعني الحقوقية وإلى غير ذلك لم تكن سباقة في هذا المجال قبل تونس. يعني حتى أبراهام لينكولن عندما أقر العتق وبعد تقريبا 18 سنة بالنسبة لتونس أقره وفق غايات سياسية. لن أدخل في التفاصيل لأنه لو أدخل في التفاصيل سأبقى أتحدث دون توقف. إذن بالنسبة للباي أعطى قيمة مهمة جدا للموسيقى للأقلية السوداء بشكل عام. بالنسبة للموسيقى الإسطنبالي هناك بعض المقولات تقول أنه سمي بالإسطنبالي لأن أحد البيات من إسطنبول كان مغرم بهذه الموسيقى. هذه معناها يعني وجهة نظر من وجهات نظر عديدة. إذن الإسطنبالي كان يقام في بلاطات البيات. هناك بعض البيات كانوا يحبذون الاحتفالات فكانوا يقيمونها عادي. هناك فكرة أخرى تقول أنه عندما يكون هناك احتفالات في بلاطات البيات أو حتى في الديار التونسية الذين هم ينتمون إلى طبقة ثرية، طبقة معينة من المجتمع، كانوا يقومون بالإسطنبالي للعبيد الذين لديهم، علما أنهم يعاملونهم معاملة حسنة، حتى يقومون بعملية تصعيد، حتى يقومون فيما بعد باحتفالات البيض على شكل جيد. يعني يسبقون الخدم عندهم ليحتفلوا ويعملوا ديفولمون عملية تصعيد، حتى يقومون فيما بعد بحفلة البي أو حفلة السيد معناها بكل أريحية وبإقبال جيد. هذا من ناحية. كذلك مسألة العنصرية في تونس لم نكن أبدا ننظر إلى طبقة الخلق.
لو اختصرت
على
مداخلتك من فضلك.
لا، أريد أن أركز على مسألة العنصرية. لسنا مجتمع عنصري ولم تكن ممارساتنا عنصرية. ولو نعود إلى تاريخ العنصرية سنعود إلى أمريكا. نحن على الأقل أقررنا العتق ولم نقر قوانين تجرم الأسياد لأنهم حرروا عبيدهم أو لم يعاقبوا عبيدهم. قانون فيرجينيا، نذكر قانون فيرجينيا. كذلك بعض الأشياء التي بعض القوانين التي كانت تعاقب السيد لا تعاقب السيد لأنه قتل ابن خادمته أو خادمه الأسود إلى غير ذلك. يعني هنا أريد أن أؤكد لسنا مجتمع عنصري. صحيح هناك نوع من الطبقية وهذا في غريزة الإنسان، في غريزة البشر، ولكن ليس هناك عنصرية على أساس اللون، بالعكس. ثم نقطة أخرى، مسألة الإسطنبالي. البارحة كان لدينا شخص هو من جذور أصيلة من إفريقيا، هو أحد أحفاد بوسعدية، ولم يسمح له أن يتكلم كما ينبغي رغم أنه يمثل هو المصدر وهو المنبع. ملاحظة أخرى، الإسطنبالي هو امتداد له باعتبار انه الاساس نتاعو هو العبوديه. هم عبيد من صحراء افريقيا انتشروا في ليبيا، في تونس، في الجزائر الى غير ذلك، ولكن هم نجد البلوز وتعني النغمات الحزينه الزرقاء، ونجد الجاز الذي يعني نغمه الفرح، وكلمتان متضادتان ولكنهما يجسدان معاناه العبوديه والاستعباد. يعني كل من وجهه نظره كيف شافها الجاز والبلوز، ولكنهما امتداد للإسطنبالي نتاع تونس. والبارحة أشار الحفيد إلى كون أكد هذه المعلومة، يعني أنا في بحثي استنتجت ذلك وهو نفسه أكد هذه المعلومة. الدكتورة أشارت إلى كون في ليبيا الظاهرة تبدو لم تنتشر كما ينبغي. لماذا؟ أشار الحفيد نفسه البارحة، اغتنمت الفرصة لأسأله بعض الأسئلة. قلت لي لماذا قمت ببحث عديد لم أجد في ليبيا نفس الشيء. الإسطنبالي، العلاج، حتى العلاج يعني بالتخميرة والموسيقى إلى غير ذلك ليس موجود في ليبيا كما هو موجود في الجزائر وفي تونس، رغم أنه يتوجه نحو الاندثار. أجابني لأن الإسطنبالي انطلق بالأساس من تونس انتشر في الجزائر، ولكن في ليبيا وقف في جهة الصفاقس في دار شقرون، أو لا أدري ما هذه الملاحظة التي قالها بشكل سريع. يعني يجب أن ننظر إلى الملاحظة الأخيرة حتى لا أطيل ولا أزعج.
شكرا.
أي آخر ملاحظة، يجب أن ننظر إلى موسيقى الإسطنبالي كفن، كموسيقى، بقطع النظر عن العبودية وإسقاط بعض المعلومات عليها من منطلق الاستعباد.
شكرا.
ونحن مجتمع لسنا عنصري. وشكرا سيداتي لأن كنا ترتدين الكوفية الفلسطينية، وإن شاء الله ربي يحرر غزة.
شكرا. مدام نسيت اسمها.
أتوجه بالشكر إلى كل المحاضرات. انتشيت بعرض يعني استثنائي الاسطنبالي بين الثابت والمتحول، لأننا عادة ما نقف أمام بحوث يعني وصفية لهذا النمط، والحال أننا بحاجة إلى استقراء الثابت والمتحول في هذا النمط بين الإقصاء والتهميش. أطياف هذه الممارسة على مستوى الفنون التشكيلية، على مستوى جغرافية الانتماء، إعادة النظر في هذه الممارسة من خلال الميوزيك فيوجن، من خلال هذه التقاطعات، هي أهم نقطة تحول في حلقات يعني الدرس في ممارسة هذا الفن الذي يبدو بدائيا ولكن له عمق ونبض. أرجو أن يكون هناك إحاطة بالمعطى الألسني ودمجه بالجانب الإثني والجغرافي لإعطاء هذه الممارسة عمقها الأصلي، لأنها ممارسة ذات صبغة ترنو إلى العالمية بقطع النظر عن كونها محلية. أرجو أن تكون هذه النقطة محور يعني دراسة مستقبلية. وبين ظفرين يعني أحتكر جزء حيزا من الوقت في هذا المنبر لأكرر أن أيقونة دحض الاستعباد هي المحسنة عزيزة عثمانة، لأنها 400 سنة 200 سنة قبل مرسوم أحمد باي وقبل يعني أبراهام لينكولن كانت أول امرأة في العالم دحضت العبودية، وكانت تستحي حول يعني اعتمادا على دراسات قامت بها ليلى بالليلي من أن تستعبد ذوي البشرة السمراء. وشكرا على سماعكم.
Qu'est-ce qui veut prendre la parole? Voilà, madame.
Bonjour, je vais parler en français parce que c'est un petit peu précis et spécialisé ce que je veux dire. On ne peut pas considérer le Stambeli uniquement en tant que musique. C'est un objet social, c'est un phénomène qui a différentes dimensions. Dimension sociale, une dimension politique, une dimension thérapeutique, qui sont très importantes et qui permettent de comprendre ce qu'est ce phénomène. Donc après le traumatisme donc de l'esclavage et des convois à travers la route subsaharienne, où il y avait énormément évidemment de décès, etc., arrivé en Afrique du Nord, il y a eu une recomposition d'une société fictive, plus ou moins mythique également. Donc, en quoi est-elle mythique? C'est que dans les rapports dominants-dominés dont on a parlé, ce sont ceux qui étaient relégués, marginalisés en bas de l'échelle sociale, et ça ne concerne pas uniquement les Noirs, ça concerne aussi le genre, donc les femmes, avaient le pouvoir sur l'autre monde, le monde invisible, des djinns, etc. Donc, c'est aussi une question qu'on peut voir, on peut en faire une lecture politique, dans le sens où la domination d'une partie de la population sur l'autre entraîne une réaction qui fait que cette domination est loin d'être parfaite. Et en particulier les harifettes dont vous avez parlé, qui sont des guérisseuses, qui font partie de la mouvance du Stambeli, exactement comme Boussadi a fait partie aussi de la même mouvance. Les harifettes avaient des autorisations du bey pour exercer. Donc, il y avait déjà une transmission, un apprentissage assez long qui commençait avec l'élection, c'est-à-dire que déjà, il fallait qu'elle soit élue, en général à travers une maladie qu'elle a ou une prédiction qu'elle a, qu'on peut nous mettre dans une certaine catégorie, mais qui, dans le monde du Stambeli, fait référence à être habité par un djinn, d'accord? Donc, c'est à partir de ce moment-là que commencent tous les rituels qui font qu'elle va maîtriser également, qu'elle peut arriver à maîtriser ce phénomène d'exorcisme et de langage avec les djinns. Donc, c'est ce qui est très important parce que je vous rappelle que les djinns sont reconnus par le Coran. L'existence des djinns est reconnue par le Coran. Donc, il ne s'agit pas d'un phénomène marginal, il s'agit au contraire d'une forme de réalité différente. Voilà. Les harifettes avaient des autorisations écrites du bey, avec le sceau du bey, et on en trouve des exemples aux archives de Tunis. Donc, il y avait une sorte de, comment dire, de tolérance de la part d'un pouvoir afin de peut-être contrôler ce qui se passait ailleurs. Voilà. Ensuite, vous avez parlé de ce que les médecins français, puisqu'on était en pleine période coloniale, avaient bon, différentes attitudes, on va dire, mais très souvent peut-être une attitude de racisme, etc. Mais il faut savoir que la médecine moderne, telle que nous la connaissons maintenant, ce n'était pas grand-chose au 19e siècle, c'était rien du tout. C'était ils n'avaient pas du tout d'arsenal thérapeutique, uniquement quelques petites plantes, un peu d'argent, un peu donc l'utilisation de la saignée, et c'est tout. Et en particulier dans la cour ombilicale, il y avait beaucoup de médecins européens qui étaient en fait des charlatans. Ils n'avaient absolument aucun support. Alors qu'en revanche, pour ce qui est de la musicothérapie, on sait maintenant que la musique peut changer votre ADN, l'ADN humain, l'épi-ADN. Donc, vous voyez un petit peu qu'une médecine occidentale qui n'avait absolument aucune base scientifique, rien du tout, et une médecine qui est une médecine, comment dire, traditionnelle, qui s'est forgée certainement en Afrique et aussi qui s'est réinventée en Tunisie, avait des bases scientifiques, mais qu'on ne connaissait pas à l'époque. Voilà.
Merci, madame. Qu'est-ce qui veut prendre la parole? Allez-y.
Bonjour, donc je voudrais prendre ma casquette de folkloriste. Personnellement, j'ai fait une thèse il y a des années sur les esclaves qui ont été transportés de l'Afrique de l'Ouest vers les États-Unis. Et donc, j'ai travaillé un peu sur le folklore ou la culture comme étant un moyen de survivre. Ce que je voudrais dire dans le contexte tunisien, c'est qu'en fait, le noir est une espèce d'altérité. Et cela fonctionne sur plusieurs strates. Il y a quelque chose, je ne sais pas si les Tunisiens le savent ou pas, quand j'étais petite, on me disait « Sadek ou Sif », c'est-à-dire Sadek, ta chance, est un noir. Et il est dans une grotte. Si les choses se passent bien, c'est que cet homme noir est debout. Si les choses se passent mal, eh ben, c'est qu'il est écroulé par terre. Donc, voilà, il y a donc toute cette altérité et je pense qu'on peut inscrire le Stambeli et toutes ces formes qui relèvent du carnivalesque, en fait, parce que c'est le désordre, il n'y a pas d'ordre, c'est toute le jam, et en fait, cela surpasse toute rationalité et on pourrait inscrire peut-être le Stambeli dans cette altérité. Elle peut être sociologique, elle peut être mentale, elle peut être culturelle, donc une liberté infinie d'être et qui relève de l'ailleurs. Je ne sais pas, j'ai fait une petite contribution dans ce sens-là. Voilà.
D'accord, merci. Merci. Alors, vous vouliez encore prendre la parole?
Je suis inspirée des dernières interventions pour dire que guérir en Occident, guérir, c'est guérir un organe, mais pour tout ce qui est Orient, c'est mettre en harmonie et semer la joie. Et peut-être le Stambeli s'inscrit dans ce deuxième registre pour animer les sens. C'est la fête des 5 sens à travers les couleurs, les senteurs et c'est la joie de vivre. Merci.
Merci. Vous voulez prendre la parole? Allez-y.
So I just have a small comment because I work on African American literature and I see so many similarities between like how like African enslaved people like lived and resisted enslavement in the US versus how they resisted it in North Africa. And I think voodoo could be also, as a cross-cultural expression, is very, very similar to Stambeli. So I don't know if you've done any kind of research, comparative research in that sense or if you see any similarities, like in terms of, I don't know, the artistic expression or, of voodoo and Stambeli. And I really loved your multi-dimensional and deep reading of Boussadia, like Boussadia as a ghost, as this kind of powerful figure, as is also clownish and all of that. It's really, I really love that. Yeah, thank you so much for your insightful reading of him. Yeah.
Merci. Alors, s'il n'y a personne qui va parler, et avant de donner la parole aux intervenants, je vais dire quelques mots. Je suis le modérateur, hein? Et je dois dire des choses. Je me demande qu'est-ce que je vais dire. Mais je vais essayer de couper un cheveu en 4, comme ça. Oui, je vais réagir sur une question qui a été évoquée par... Ils m'ont précédé, c'est-à-dire évoqué par ceux qui venaient de parler. En écoutant les deux exposés, je sens qu'il y a une différence entre deux mondes, tout à fait différents, aussi bien dans l'espace que dans le temps. La Libye, au XXe siècle, et Boussadia, et la Tunisie, au XIXe siècle, précolonial, mais la colonisation a peut-être aussi mis les pieds pour démarrer. Alors, il y a une différence de perception du phénomène. Je n'ai jamais entendu parler, ou du moins c'est ce que j'ai compris, de racisme vis-à-vis de Boussadia. Il est même en symbiose totale avec la société libyenne. C'est extraordinaire. Aucune stigmatisation du phénomène. Il est approprié. Lui-même se refusait de partir, vous disiez. Mais pour la Tunisie, et dans votre exposé, il y a un mot qui se répète très souvent, qui a été évoqué par Madame, racisme. Alors, moi je dis, il faut penser les catégories qu'on utilise. Alors, peut-on parler de racisme? Vous l'avez dit, mais désolé, je vais le dire peut-être autrement. La catégorie raciste ou la race, elle a un temps. Elle a commencé à partir d'un certain temps. Elle n'est pas une catégorie qui se trouvait dans le passé. Non. Alors, il y avait quoi s'il n'y avait pas racisme? C'est vrai qu'on peut stigmatiser des gens. Est-ce qu'on les stigmatisait parce qu'ils appartiennent à une autre race ou on les stigmatise autrement? Eh bien, il faut rappeler une chose. La société du monde, jusqu'à la Révolution française, est une société construite sur le mode aristocratique. Et ça, depuis les civilisations même pré-islamiques, pré-chrétiennes, pré-judaïques, les gens appartiennent à des strates. Ibn Khaldoun, par exemple, il parle de deux catégories. Ceux qui se trouvent en haut, et As-Safala, ceux qui se trouvent en bas. Ibn Khaldoun, c'est quelqu'un de intelligent, etc., mais il adopte cette vision du monde aristocratique. Et lui, il se considère comme faisant partie de Ilya al-Qawm, ceux qui sont supérieurs. Et cette conception aristocratique a été conservée dans la mentalité de tout le monde jusqu'à la Révolution française. Avant la Révolution française, il y avait quoi? Il y avait les strates. Il y a ceux qui prient, ceux qui combattent et ceux qui travaillent. Et chacun doit être dans sa case naturelle. Et on ne doit jamais passer d'une case à une autre. C'est la Révolution française qui a créé ce qu'on appelle l'égalité, comment dire, j'ai perdu le
Liberté,
non, oui, mais l'égalité entre les individus. Les gens sont égaux. Et c'est ça ce qui est apporté par la Révolution française. Mais restons avec la Révolution française et en France. Ailleurs, dans un pays comme la Tunisie, non, on n'est pas encore là. Jusqu'au milieu du 19e siècle, je dis bien jusqu'au milieu du 19e siècle, la société a une conception aristocratique. Il a fallu 1857, Ahd al-Aman, le pacte fondamental, qui déclare que tout le monde appartienne, c'est-à-dire que les gens sont égaux. Il n'y a aucune différence entre musulmans et non-musulmans, et ça c'est pour la première fois qu'on dise il n'y a aucune différence entre un musulman et non-musulman, du moins théoriquement. Dans la pratique, c'est autre chose. Du moins théoriquement, on le dit. Il n'y a aucune différence entre ceux qui séparent. Il y avait une séparation jusque-là entre les citadins, Beldi, et les ruraux, Arbi. Il n'y a plus aussi, théoriquement, on a aboli cette distinction. Donc, on commençait au milieu du 19e siècle à dépasser l'ancienne conception aristocratique de la société pour une autre société qui affirme l'égalité. Mais ça ne va pas se réaliser tout de suite. On sait parfaitement bien qu'on a l'esclavage, bien qu'il soit aboli depuis 1848, on a des documents qui montrent qu'on pratiquait encore l'esclavage même jusqu'au début de la colonisation. Bref, pour dire finalement que en Tunisie, il n'y avait pas l'idée de racisme. Les gens ne pensent pas en termes de racisme, ils pensent en termes de statut. Tu appartiens à quoi? À un statut, mais pas race. Bien sûr, les statuts, les gens ne sont pas égaux. Ce n'est pas la même chose, mais des statuts. Il faut chercher des statuts et non des races. On ne souligne pas des races, mais on souligne des statuts. Voilà, à mon avis, pourquoi on ne peut pas parler de racisme à cette époque-là. Bien sûr, vous pouvez me dire que les colons ou ceux qui pratiquent le colonialisme, parce que ça a commencé, et bien la colonisation n'a pas, à mon avis, apporté le principe de l'égalité. Au contraire, ils ont inventé une autre manière de maintenir cette inégalité entre une Europe soi-disant avancée et un monde non européen arriéré, et que les Européens ils sont là pour l'évoluer, etc. Donc, je reviens à l'idée qu'il faut faire attention, à mon avis, quand on utilise des catégories, comme catégorie race et racisme. Il y avait autre chose à cette époque-là, et puis ça diffère des gens. Bon, excuse-moi si peut-être que j'ai fait quelque chose, j'espère que ça ne vous dérange pas. Non, voilà, merci. Alors, vous voulez prendre encore une fois la parole? Non, mais elle a le droit de répondre.
Okay.
Hein? Oui, allez-y. Vous répondez après.
Merci à toutes et à tous. يعيشك ألف شكر. I'm sorry, I will respond in English, but I do hope I make sense. I don't use the words racism. I specifically use the word racialization, which is different. So I'm not disagreeing with either of the comments that have to do with race and racialization. And in fact, can I actually, because I'm not, again, I'm not in disagreement. I actually want to be really particular about what I'm saying when I say racialize as Black, because as you noted, it's not about skin color necessarily, not skin color necessarily. In fact, as we saw yesterday in Dr. Montana's presentation, when we were talking about Sudan, Tunis, this has to do with religion. It's about Islam, right? And so when I'm thinking about racialization, I'm not talking about a North American understanding of race as skin color. I'm talking about what it means in the time period, which has a lot to do with geographic origins and presumed religion, not as much about skin color whatsoever, actually. So I wish I had been a little more clear, and I appreciate the comments because it tells me I wasn't as clear about that. So thank you. Thank you. Yes, I did. So just to point out again, in English, this may be really hard to see, I apologize, but on the left, you can't see, it's okay. On the left, we see the word two slaves, men, Black. On the right, we see Abd and Kheden. These are not the same. That's what I'm saying. They're not the same. There are these different understandings of what race and Blackness mean at the time. Europeans have one impression. Northern Africans and Western African elites have a different impression that is much more to do with religion and much more to do with geographic origins. So I'm saying they're not the same. These are different. And so that's more of the book project. I don't talk about it as much in the presentation, but I just wanted to underline that point. Thank you. Merci.
Merci. À vous la parole.
Now, I really wish I also wish that I could make my point in either French or Arabic. That's a matter of history, like many of these things, that I cannot. But what I want to suggest are maybe two things. One is that the kind of total appropriation, the absorption of Boussadia into a kind of normative Libyan cultural, let's call it sort of sea, is exactly what makes me pause. It's exactly what gives me pause, that this seems to be unproblematic. I think it is the things that we sometimes think are just what we do, just how we are, that we might consider a bit more deeply. So that's one point. And the second, I think I would want to suggest is that this, by the way, I should mention, a number of the images in this presentation I think are quite remarkable. This one included, all these ones that are kind of this sort of sepia tinted, come from a blog post, from a blog written by an Italian man whose father was in the Italian military in Libya. And he talks in this blog about the fact that he found this film roll. And this is what he found on it. And he himself didn't know what these photographs were. And so did his own sort of internet research to try to ascertain, what was this practice. And I think these photographs are absolutely incredible because you see, you see actualized this sort of constellation of powers in this particular moment. You have, people who are in military uniform, you have the performers of this practice. And I think, there's much to say, but I think at the very least, we have to say that when there is a practice, a performance practice that is dominated by people who are racialized in a particular way, there is something there that doesn't happen neutrally, right? And I think it's imperative. I'm certainly not a historian, so I wouldn't try to trace. Historians have traced these questions of how do we understand racial paradigms that come out of European colonialism, and must we consider racial paradigms that precede, that interact with European colonial racial paradigms? And I would suggest, as a scholar of contemporary Libya, and who has, experience in other parts of the region, that we in our families, in our daily discourses, have an attachment to whiteness that is not unrelated to global discourses and practices of white supremacy. It is not identical, right? One thing people often say is, well, when I'm Tunisian, I'm in France, I'm treated with racism. Yeah, 100% true. But it's possible to inhabit different positionalities depending on where and with whom you are. So the same family that can say we were marginalized and treated as outsiders and others and racially denigrated in one context, let's say in France for ease, in Italy, might still themselves in their family say, oh, we like that Black family, but my daughter cannot marry them. What is that practice if it's not racism? And we do ourselves a deep disservice to deny these practices and these discourses.
En principe, on a terminé et on vous remercie pour votre présence et pour toutes ces contributions assez intéressantes qui suscitent un débat parfois fort. Et je vous remercie.
Okay.
Votre mot.
Okay, please, we have come to the end of this session. I'd like to ask everyone to join me in thanking our two panelists, Dr. Tayyip and Dr. Boal, and of course, our wonderful animated moderator, Dr. Hania. So thank you very much.
Thank you.